Okay, hello, and today we're going to talk about chapter 11. It's actually chapter 12 in the text, but I rearranged things a little bit in the course. So today I'm going to talk about mining, about what I call treasures underground. So natural resources have always been a very important motivation for the nations that came to the Americas to explore and exploit the resources here. So in this chapter, we're going to explore the treasures that the Europeans and Americans found in the Western Hemisphere and the ongoing search for those resources. So let's begin. So natural resources found underground have been an important part of American history. As I've already discussed earlier, extracting wealth from the newly discovered continent was one of the major motivations of the early Europeans, especially the Spanish, who invested their time and their wealth and took the risks of coming to the New World. Natives of North and South America were already using gold and silver and copper to make tools and to make ornaments. And European explorers from Europe confiscated these riches very quickly from native cities and then, of course, speculated about additional hidden cities of treasure, like the legendary El Dorado, which they never found. The wealth that they did find transformed Europe and Asia, and later the American economy as well, and helped create a global economy where borders are porous to treasures from underground. This, of course, is a view again of the Spanish imperial city of Potosi in what was the Viceroyalty of Peru and is now Bolivia, which was the site of the largest silver lode ever discovered in the Americas, which has turned out to be probably the largest in the world. The city was built in the mid-1500s, beginning around 1542, on top of an earlier Indian mining village in the shadow of a mountain that the Spanish dubbed the Cerro Rico, which is Spanish for rich mountain. The mountain has been mined continuously for over 500 years and is still producing silver. By the early 1600s, Potosi's population exploded to 160,000 Spanish colonists and nearly 15,000 Indians who worked in the mines in a mandatory labor system called the Mita, which had originally developed in the Inca Empire as more of a seasonal labor draft and was continued by the Spanish as more or less slavery. After silver ore was removed from tunnels in the Cerro Rico, it was processed using a technique that involved grinding and mercury amalgamation. The ore was crushed in 140 ingenios or mills, and they were operated with water power from about 22 different dams and reservoirs in the region. And then it was mixed with mercury, and the slurry that was stirred together, mixed together, was then baked in kilns to separate the silver. And so what would happen is the mercury, which is, of course, much more volatile. It's liquid at room temperature, and it vaporizes at a very low temperature as well. So the mercury would evaporate off, and then you'd be left with slag and silver. And so the workers would then stamp bars of silver with the mark of the Spanish Royal Mint and carry them by mule trains to Panama, usually to be shipped to Spain. Now, the Cerro Rico is a volcanic dome that rises about a half a mile over the city, which stands at an altitude of over 13,000 feet. Conditions in the mines were harsh, and mercury poisoning from the vapors out of the kilns caused weakness, poor coordination, kidney disease, and ultimately death. Due to the strenuous work and the thin atmosphere, most of the natives had to chew coca leaves to counteract altitude sickness. This was the original use of coca in indigenous communities, was altitude sickness. But the mountain's wealth and and the silver that could be pulled out of it was a potent motivation during the second half of the 16th century. So Potosi attracted 160,000 people and produced 60% of all the silver mined in the world. And the Spanish Empire, of course, depended on the Cerro Rico's constant flow of revenue. When there were no adequate numbers of Indians left to fill the mita, colonial mine owners began importing African slaves, who also died in large numbers, and probably in larger numbers because they weren't used to working in that type of altitude. After Bolivian independence in the early 19th century, slavery was outlawed. And actually, Simon Bolivar came and walked to the top of the Cerro Rico and said there will be no more slavery in the mines here. So labor conditions, however, have remained harsh to the present day. And this is a picture of people working the mine currently. Even in modern times, the average life expectancy of a Potosi silver miner is about 35 years, due this time to silicosis rather than to mercury poisoning. The Cerro Rico is known locally in Bolivia as the mountain that eats men. But in the past 500 years, Potosi has produced over 60,000 metric tons of silver. The Spanish Empire was not as successful finding gold in the Americas as it had been finding silver. Although the conquistadors managed to loot the Aztec and the Inca empires of their treasures, many of the most important American gold mining breakthroughs were made centuries later. Gold was first discovered in the United States in the 1790s, when several nuggets weighing up to 28 pounds were discovered in rivers in North Carolina. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, North Carolina mines actually produced all of the gold that was sent to the U.S. Mint until 1929, when Virginia and Georgia and Alabama began sending small quantities. The discovery of substantial amounts of gold in 1848 in the vicinity of Sutter's Mill in Northern California near Sacramento created America's first gold rush. It's unclear whether the American government was really aware of the possibility of finding large quantities of precious metals in the West when we went to war against Mexico in 1846. But in the treaty that ended the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, the U.S. acquired territory that became California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, and part of Colorado and Kansas. Unlike the Spanish Empire, which had controlled mineral production through a long-standing legal tradition that reserved ownership of all subsurface resources for the nation, rather than allowing individual ownership of mines and their products. The United States created a property ownership system that included subsurface as well as surface assets. Title to mineral claims in the U.S. was validated primarily by proof of discovery and by persistence. That is, a prospector would claim the land and the minerals beneath it if he could prove that he had discovered and had consistently worked the claim. A rush of migration following news of the discovery at Sutter's Mill on the American River west of Sacramento resulted in California statehood in 1850. In 1849 alone, California gold mines produced 3 times the amount of the $15 million payment that the U.S. had made to Mexico to acquire the entire Mexican cession, all that territory that we took from them in the war. And the new territory's population doubled in less than a year. California became the 31st state in September 1850. Congress accepted California under the terms of the Compromise of 1850, which, although it created the bloody Kansas controversies of the 1850s, probably helped the Union win the Civil War. Under the Compromise of 1850, California entered the U.S. as a free state in return for other concessions that strengthened Southern slavery. But when the Civil War began in 1861, California's mines delivered gold to the U.S. Treasury, to the Union side, throughout the conflict, sending over $186 million between 1861 and 1864. To better connect California with the rest of the Union, of course, the Lincoln administration rushed the Pacific Railroad Act legislation through Congress, authorizing a transcontinental railroad and granting the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad corporations large amounts of public land, as we've already talked about. The silver that supported the Union cause came primarily from Nevada, where the Comstock lode, which was developed in the last years of the 1850s, had quickly shifted from the hands of its original discoverers to well-financed corporations run by investors such as George Hearst. Nevada is still the second largest silver producer in the U.S. after Alaska. The Comstock lode was discovered in 1859 in western Nevada and quickly fell under the control of Hearst, who later developed the Ontario silver mine, which was discovered in 1872 in northern Utah. Hearst went on to invest in the Homestake gold mine in the Black Hills of South Dakota and in the Anaconda copper mine in Montana. The Homestake mine, which was discovered in 1876, operated until 2002 and became the second largest gold producer in North America, as well as the world's largest and deepest gold mine. Hearst originally bought the Anaconda mine in Butte, Montana as a silver mine in 1881, but after high-grade copper ore was discovered there, Butte became known by locals, who had apparently never heard of Potosi, as the richest hill on earth. And then from 1892 to 1903, the Butte Anaconda mine was the world's leading copper producer. This is the Homestake gold mine as it appeared in 1889. By the early 20th century, American mining companies had become highly capitalized corporations. Homestake, for example, was first listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 1879, making it the first mine listed, and also one of the longest listed stocks in the New York Stock Exchange's history. Homestake was bought in 2002 by the Canadian-based Barrick Gold Corporation. Anaconda profited from copper's increasing value with the development of electrification, because it's the conductor most used in wires. And the company fought off a takeover bid by the Rothschild International Banking Conglomerate by allying itself closely with Standard Oil Company, which we will talk about in a bit. In the early 1920s, Anaconda began acquiring mines in Mexico and in Chile. In 1923, Anaconda bought the Chuquicamata mine in northern Chile from the Guggenheim family of New York, the people who have the museum named after them. The legendary Chuquicamata was the world's largest copper mine through most of the 20th century and has been an important factor in Chile's history and in the story of American intervention in that history, as we'll see. North American copper was widely used by pre-Columbian natives who found the metal in large deposits in what's now northern Michigan and beat it into ear pendants and necklaces and bracelets and knives and arrowheads. And a lot of trade goods. Copper items became widely used by Indians and were carried over a surprisingly wide trade network. Explorer Sebastian Cabot wrote in 1497 that the native people of Newfoundland used a great plenty of copper. And Giovanni Verrazzano reported that among the Indian residents of Nantucket Island, copper was valued higher than gold. On the other side of the continent, Russian explorers in what's now Alaska found natives using copper knives in the 1740s. And although they didn't possess the types of smelting and forging technologies that Europeans and Asians had developed by the time they began colonizing the Americas, there's a lot of evidence that the natives, the Indians, mined gold and silver and copper, and even used coal for cooking centuries before their first contact with Europeans. Most of the copper now mined in the world comes out of the ground in ores that need extensive processing. But Michigan copper was unique. Indians and later European prospectors discovered rich veins of metallic copper that didn't require any processing. In some cases, miners actually found boulders of solid copper weighing several tons. One large copper outcropping that was reported by a British trader in 1776 was estimated at 5 tons, and it was surrounded by old stone tools and had cut marks on it where pieces had been chopped away. The British trader who found it wrote that, quote, "Such was its purity and malleable state that with an axe I was able to cut off a portion weighing 100 pounds," end quote. When miners finally dug up the entire block of what they call the Ontonagon copper boulder and sent it to the Smithsonian Institution in 1843, it still weighed 3,708 pounds. In addition to the remote copper deposits of Michigan, in the 1710s, Dutch colonists rediscovered a small vein of copper ore in New Jersey. And I say rediscover because old hammers and tools that were found at the site suggest that the vein had also previously been worked either by earlier colonists or by natives before that. By the 1730s, the output of this New Jersey vein was 1,386 tons, in spite of the fact that the colonists were not allowed to smelt ore or refine the copper. Instead, the ore was packed in barrels and shipped to Bristol, England for processing. In spite of their initial failure to discover great caches of precious metals, English colonists in North America continued trying to develop mineral resources. In 1619, the London Company sent 153 iron workers to Virginia, to Jamestown, to develop 3 discoveries there. Work began on the largest site, which was 32 miles inland on a branch of the James River, in 1620, the same year that the Plymouth Pilgrims arrived. A year later, 20 additional experienced workers were sent to the new mine under the direction of an English aristocrat named John Berkeley. Although these miners made progress, the Indians attacked the ironworks in 1822 in one of the Powhatan Wars and killed the 347 workers there, including Berkeley. The operation was completely destroyed. 2 decades later, John Winthrop Jr., the son of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's governor, organized a company to develop the iron ore discovered in bogs, called bog iron, around the town of Lynn. When the younger Winthrop then became governor of Connecticut in 1657, he began an ironworks in New Haven. Smelting bog ore continued in Middleborough, Massachusetts, all the way to the Revolutionary War, along with the forging of nails, until an act of Parliament prohibited smelting in the colonies to support the industry in England. And this protectionist measure was another one of those that was resented by the colonists and probably helped to fuel the revolutionary cause. By 1810, production of iron in the new United States was valued by the Treasury Department at $13 million, which was more than 3 times the iron that Americans imported. The Treasury's report counted over 500 forges in the new nation. And to protect this fledgling industry, the first tariff on iron imports was levied in 1816. The first large deposit of iron ore on Lake Superior in this region was reported in a letter written in 1840 by Douglas Houghton, Michigan's first state geologist, and the guy that Houghton, Michigan, which is where the copper mines are, is named after. This discovery was corroborated in 1844 by a survey party whose compass needle was attracted by a large mass of iron ore, so they were pulled off course. And in 1845, a local Indian chief named Manjekikik led a prospecting party to what the prospectors described as, quote, a mountain of solid iron ore, 150 feet high and as bright as a bar of iron just broken." End quote. In return for his help, the chief was promised a substantial share of the mining company's stock. The bounty was never paid, and the chief died in poverty. The first blast furnace in Michigan was built to process ore there in 1858, about the same time, more or less, that blast furnaces were beginning to be built in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And the Civil War greatly accelerated the development of Michigan iron for use in the Union's war effort, and then for the building of railroads. Development of coal resources also accelerated the production of iron. As mentioned earlier, coal had been used for generations by Indians for cooking, and the early missionaries and explorers had written frequently of Indians making fire with coal from the earth in the 17th century. The missionary explorer Father Louis Hennepin, for example, reported visiting an Indian village on the Illinois River in 1679. Coking of coal, which means baking it in an airless kiln at extreme temperatures, well over 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit, to increase its effectiveness, began in the 1840s and used the vast anthracite coal deposits discovered in western Pennsylvania, which helped Pittsburgh become the center of steel production in the 1850s. It was really not about the iron ore, it was about the coal that was available. Pittsburgh steel producers introduced a number of technological improvements to the process, including coke fire smelting in 1859 and the Bessemer process for removing impurities by oxidation in 1875. By the beginning of the 20th century, Pittsburgh was the center of a steel-producing area that made a quarter of the nation's railroad track and 2/3 of the structural steel that was becoming very popular in construction, and which led to the ability to build skyscrapers. By the late 1880s, Carnegie Steel was the world's largest producer of pig iron, steel rails, and coke. In 1883, Andrew Carnegie bought a rival company, Homestead Steel Works, and in 1892, he launched the Carnegie Steel Company. In 1901, when the 66-year-old Carnegie was preparing for retirement, he was approached by Wall Street banker John Pierpont Morgan, and Morgan paid Carnegie $250 million for his business, and then combined it with several others to create U.S. Steel, which was the world's first corporation with a market capitalization over $1 billion. Carnegie, who believed that a man who dies rich dies disgraced, devoted most of the rest of his life to giving his wealth to philanthropic causes, including over 3,000 public libraries that he established in the US and Canada and throughout the English-speaking world. By the time of his death in 1919, Carnegie had distributed over $350 million of his wealth. All he had left was about $30 million, and that was given to a variety of foundations and charities. Western historian Patricia Nelson Limerick summed up the opinions of generations of historians when she said, "No industry had a greater impact on Western history than did mining." Mining introduced Westerners to an entrepreneurial ideal, but also to an expectation of making extreme profits, often very quickly and with little effort. That was the expectation. Many Americans looked to the West as a source of easy wealth, which led hundreds of thousands of young men and a few young women to throw caution to the wind and rush out to the California gold rush, or to Virginia City, or to Pikes Peak, and later to the Yukon. But as Limerick observed, mining changed rapidly from an individual enterprise where average people could become rich by luck or by hard work, to a very highly capitalized industrial business. Far from being a refuge from toiling for wages in factories, Western mines created a new industry of mineral extraction and processing. In fact, mines featured the same combination of expensive capital and interchangeable cheap wage labor as textile factories back in Massachusetts. However, as a lot of people who migrated to the mining frontiers found out, to their embarrassment and distress, there were fewer employment alternatives for disgruntled workers in the mining regions. Many unsuccessful prospectors found themselves in debt for supplies, for lodging, for transportation, for food, and trapped in low-paying jobs until they could save enough money to buy a ticket back to civilization. The unique element that mining retained, however, was what Limerick called the mood of the extractive industry, which, as she described it, was get in, get rich, and get out. Many young prospectors were excited by tales of quick money that could be made, panning and then working easy-to-obtain placer claims. Placer gold is, or any mineral. Placer minerals are things that are just lying around on the ground, often in stream beds. So their extraction often amounts to little more than picking up the ore that's lying on the surface. Thousands succumbed to this fever and rushed to the west, only to find themselves stranded in California without enough money to return home. So after several years of hard work for low wages, some men did earn enough to return home. In the meantime, a lot found themselves to be what one person called in a condition of convicts condemned to exile and hard labor. And as the first phase of placer collection gave way to a second phase of underground mining and hydraulic work, which is pictured here, the advantage quickly shifted to corporations that controlled the capital and could buy the technology and could coordinate the efforts of these wage workers. Power transferred to corporations with access to Eastern capital and to these large labor forces. People who had flocked to the gold fields in hope of windfalls found themselves working for wages under conditions that were every bit as demanding as the urban factory workers that they had left behind. Mining was a very difficult and dangerous job. But the miners were generally not compensated for the risks that they took, and they rarely were taken care of when accidents happened. The courts used the principle of assumed risk to rule that mining companies bore no responsibility for injured workers because the workers presumably had known that the job was dangerous when they took it. The court's assumption that workers could refuse tasks that they considered too dangerous may have been deliberately naive, but labor unions did not have the power to challenge the mine owners in the courts. Mining companies took advantage of what historians called a lag of perception, in which the old times of individual opportunity still set the basic rules and attitudes, and the new times of corporate centralization of power still had not been recognized. In other words, the myth of prospectors taking risks in order to get rich was used as cover for corporations to subject wage workers to danger and to harsh conditions. Another area where the ongoing myth of a Wild West, filled with easy, democratic resource exploitation, was used to benefit mining corporations was the anti-environmentalist idea expressed by a mining executive who said about future generations, "Those who succeed us can well take care of themselves." And what about oil? The word petroleum comes from two Latin root words, meaning rock, petram, and oil, oleum. And they called it that to distinguish it from plant or animal-based oils. As we've already seen, before the development of the petroleum industry, both whale oil and ethyl alcohol were used and burned as fuels. As I mentioned earlier, the petroleum industry began in America in 1859, when George Bissell and Edwin Drake drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, at a site known as Oil Creek. But these weren't the world's first oil wells. The very first oil wells were drilled by Russian engineers in the Asperon Peninsula on the west side of the Caspian Sea, near Baku in Azerbaijan, beginning about 1848. So a full decade before oil drilling begins in America. American attempts to drill for natural gas had begun in the 1820s in Chautauqua County in New York. After the success of the Titusville well, oil was drilled at other locations in western Pennsylvania and in New York and in the Ohio River Valley, where oil had been discovered seeping to the surface. The Appalachian Basin was America's leading oil-producing region in the beginning of the last quarter of the 19th century. By 1881, the Bradford Field in western Pennsylvania was producing 77% of world oil output. The principal product of this oil was kerosene, which was used as lamp oil. Early kerosene was produced in a wide variety of volatility and flammability. Some of it was dangerous and explosive. John D. Rockefeller named his company Standard Oil to highlight the safety and consistency of the kerosene that he produced. The Standard Oil Company, begun in Cleveland in 1870, soon dominated the kerosene market in Ohio and then across the nation. A few decades later, by the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire once again led the world in oil production, and commercial oil extraction was also underway in Sumatra, in Persia, Peru, Venezuela, Mexico, in addition to in the U.S. in Ohio and Texas and Southern California. The oil exploration spread quickly, as I said, to Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, North Louisiana, and East Texas in the 1890s. The Los Angeles Basin began producing oil products in the 1880s and 1890s. But because of the different chemical makeup of California oil, it was less appropriate for kerosene and was used mostly to produce fuel oil and asphalt. Think La Brea tar pits. In the early years of the 20th century, California's Long Beach and Wilmington oil fields became the world's leading producers of oil per acre, leading the development of the port of Los Angeles as a hub for overseas shipment of oil. In addition to drilling wells on land, oil companies developed both anchored and floating platforms for extracting oil from beneath the seabed. The Gulf of Mexico is now the most explored, drilled, and developed offshore petroleum province in the world. It's been in development since the end of World War II in 1945. The Gulf now produces about 34% of the world's crude oil and about 25% of the world's natural gas. This image is actually of the gas fields because I couldn't find one of the oil fields. The continental shelf off the coast of Texas and Louisiana is dotted with over 4,000 active platforms, with 35,000 wells and 29,000 miles of pipeline. But in spite of these offshore projects, conventional oil discoveries in the lower 48 states peaked in 1930 and production peaked in 1970. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester when I talk about limits and peaks. Standard Oil was prosecuted as a monopoly under the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1911, and it was forced to split into 34 independent operating units. The largest were Standard Oil of New Jersey, SO, which became known as Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, Mobil, Standard Oil of California, Chevron, Standard Oil of Indiana, Amoco, and Standard Oil of Ohio, SoHio. So in addition to all these baby standards, there were a small number of international petroleum companies formed in the early years that retain a lot of control of a large portion of the industry. These included Royal Dutch Shell, which was formed in 1907 as a merger of a Dutch company and a British company, and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which was then later known as the Anglo-Iranian and ultimately as British Petroleum, founded in 1909. In 1968, British Petroleum, BP, bought Sohio and began developing a major oil field discovered in Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. Multinational petroleum companies like ExxonMobil, which is another recombination of two of the baby standards that merged again in 1998 to become the world's largest oil company. So companies like ExxonMobil and BP have become increasingly able to project their economic power to shape the politics of the nations where they do business. And effects of this power include the opening of new federal lands in America, including national parks and nature reserves, to drilling in the Arctic Circle, and the minimal penalties that were assessed against corporations for disasters, like the 11 million gallon Exxon Valdez spill in 1989, or the BP Deepwater Horizon explosion and the 210 million gallon spill that resulted from that in 2010. As multinational petroleum corporations grew, they not only influenced the politics of the nations in which they operated, but they tried to direct the foreign policies of their home nations. For example, when Lázaro Cárdenas nationalized oil production in Mexico in 1938 and created Pemex, the national Mexican oil company that still exists today, oil companies asked the American government to intervene. But Franklin D. Roosevelt was busy fighting against corporate interests that were trying to undermine his New Deal policies that he was implementing to mitigate the Great Depression. So he declined to interfere in Mexico's right to control its subsurface assets, which really were just a natural continuation of those legal traditions of the Spanish Empire that Latin American nations inherited when they became independent. The corporations had better luck after the Iranian Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, decided to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, BP, in 1951. BP got the help of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who then turned to U.S. President Harry S. Truman to help him get rid of Mossadegh. Truman didn't want to initially, but this is about the same time that Churchill came to America and made his famous Iron Curtain speech. So maybe we traded Britain's support for our fight against the dropping of the dominoes all around the world in our mission to get rid of communism to their mission to get rid of Mossadegh. So in any case, Mossadegh had to go. So Britain's MI6 and the CIA replaced the elected prime minister of Iran with the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had been the Shah all along, but the Shah used to be kind of a ceremonial title, like the Queen of England, and now the Shah was actually in control of the government. And he ruled with kind of an iron fist until the Iranian Revolution of 1979. After the Shah's installation, Iranian oil production jumped from an average of about 1 million barrels per day in the early 1950s to nearly 6 million barrels a day in the early 1970s. Petroleum is not the only resource that has led corporations to interfere in the political affairs of sovereign nations. The Norte Grande region of Chile that Chile took away from Peru and Bolivia in the War of the Pacific to gain control of the nitrate deposits of the Atacama Desert that I mentioned in the Green Revolution chapter, also contains some of the world's richest copper deposits. Chuquicamata is the largest open pit mine in the world, and the nearby Escondida mine is nearly as big. And is the world's most productive copper mine. In central Chile, about 57 miles south of the capital, Santiago, is the world's largest underground mine, in El Teniente. Copper mining has been a leading industry in Chile throughout the nation's history. But in the early 20th century, Chilean mines were increasingly bought by American corporations, and the industry became dominated by large U.S. mining conglomerates like Anaconda and like Kennecott, which is owned by the Guggenheim brothers. In the late 1960s, Chile began nationalizing its copper industry, with seizures beginning under a Christian Democrat coalition government and continuing under the socialist government of President Salvador Allende. Corporate dissatisfaction with the nationalizations led to a CIA-backed coup that resulted in the death of President Allende and the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet from 1973 to 1990. Ironically, Pinochet did not give back the copper mines, and Codelco, Chile's national copper company, is still the world's largest copper supplier. Since the end of the dictatorship and the reestablishment of democracy in Chile, foreign companies have again been invited to develop mines, this time in parallel with Codelco, which remains there. And that Escondida mine that I mentioned is actually owned by an Australian-based multinational, BHP Billiton. Other companies operating mines in Chile include US-based Phelps Dodge and the Japanese Zaibatsu Sumitomo. Chile's economy is now regarded as one of South America's most stable and prosperous, most first world-like. The nation produces a third of the world's copper, which accounts for 53% of Chile's exports. And the emergence of China as Chile's main export partner, China buys fully a quarter of Chile's exports, has probably helped reduce the influence of US corporations in Chilean internal affairs, and may have even helped to end the dictatorship, which had been widely, if quietly, supported by American diplomats and vocally supported by free market economists like the technocrats of the Chicago School, who were key advisors to the Pinochet regime. So to conclude, national borders have never been particularly effective in preventing natural resources, especially non-renewable resources like minerals and petroleum, from finding their way into markets where they're most valued. Underground treasures like oil and silver and gold and copper have become the energy and the mineral wealth that powers the world economy. So that is our look at treasures underground. I hope that was helpful, and I will see you next time. Thanks.